So we are very fortunate to have with us today Judy Pinnolis. Judy is Associate Director of Library at the Berklee College of Music and Boston Conservatory. She is adjunct faculty at Hebrew College teaching Jewish musicology. She is creator of the Jewish Music Web Center, past chair of the Jewish Music Roundtable of Music Library Association, and the president of the New England chapter of the American Association of College and Research Libraries, and the author of numerous articles and encyclopedia entries. Good to have you with us, Judy.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So, in our last program, we looked at an earlier period from antiquity until the early modern period, and we investigated the roles that Jewish women played or were not allowed to play in music. So, I'm interested in exploring with you how change came about. So, first of all, could you tell us about the first women prayer leaders, the Zogovin, I think they're called?
Right. So we know from writings and also from known synagogue practice that there were separate sections for the men and women, starting in about the 12th century, the gendered sections in synagogue. And for quite a number of reasons, including architecture, it was hard for people to hear in the women's gallery.
So, Judy, that means before the 12th century, there was no place for women altogether in the synagogues?
The earliest information I have is that we can date it back to the 12th century. Um, that we know for sure that there were gendered sections, at least in Ashkenazi Jewry and probably in other and Sephardic Jewry. And a lot of this we can also establish through architecture and writings. So there's evidence of the separation of men and women.
Mhm.
Not only that, but the traditions that came down over time. And we know that, and we have the names of some of the women on occasion here and there, in this, at least in terms of the 17th century, of women who were prayer leaders. And these prayer leaders, remember, this is before printed Sidurim. So people did not have books with them in the synagogue. Things were recited by rote. Uh, so we have the women who were reciting the prayers in these areas, and they used a very particularized sing-song method to recite the prayers and to chant along with the cantors who were down in the main part, or the Shaliach Sibur, who was in the main part of the sanctuary. And they were educated women. They knew Hebrew. They could, in effect, give an interpretation of the prayers for the women. And we have a number of the Yiddish type names of Verzogerin, Zangerin, Zolgerin, these different kinds of pronunciations that help us know that they were singing or chanting the texts along with the synagogue services. So these patterns were created. And there was also, there are descriptions about the weeping nature and the stylized nature of this kind of recitation of prayers. And so we also know that they chanted piyutim, and supplications, along with the services. So these women were carried, this tradition carried on throughout Europe, and came even to the United States into up to about the 19th and maybe even into the early 20th century in some areas. We certainly have some documentation that it came to the United States in the 19th century, up to the 19th century.
Do we have any indication of how widespread this was? Are these isolated instances?
I think that the evidence that we have certainly is limited in certain sections because of the nature of survival of documents.
Mm.
But it is considered that it was a widespread practice wherever there were educated women. Sometimes these women were the wives or the daughters of cantors or rabbis, and they would have been more educated than the general population of women in their towns or little communities that they lived in. So these kinds of musical activities carried on through for centuries.
So then in more modern times, we have the chazante, a woman who sang Jewish liturgical music, but generally on a stage or on radio and recordings and not part of the actual synagogue liturgy. Tell us about that.
Well, as you know, when Jews came to the United States and they brought their Yiddish culture with them, one of the things that happened is that women were singers in the light opera or operettas, if you will, that became Yiddish theater and songs that were added. And it was very interesting that one of the things that happened is you very frequently saw women singing liturgical music on the stage in the Yiddish theater, or semi liturgical music or quasi liturgical music, sacred songs in the course of the act or the storyline of these Yiddish theater productions. And so you got an American audience who became more used to seeing women singing this kind of music, singing words and text with Hebrew, singing it with Yiddish, and singing these sacred kinds of music. And then you see that this kind of music, where women are on the stage and doing performance of sacred music, it becomes carried over into a kind of performance for other venues. So when Jews go to recreational areas or later the Catskills and other things, in those kinds of settings, women started performing music. It was entertainment, and the entertainment was chazanut. And they frequently were the daughters, again, the daughters of cantors who could not sing in the synagogue for the whole community, but sang these kinds of songs as in entertainment venues, whether it's the Yiddish theater stage or later other types of venues. And we see what happens in the 20th century is that with this technology that comes about, radio and recording, the cylinders, and then later, of course, LPs, that they produce this music and record it. And one of the things you see about the chazantas or chazantas is that they imitate the male voice as much as possible. They lower their voice, they use the deeper registers, and they are producing the popular chazanut sound of the day, which at that period of time is what we call the golden age of chazanut in the
So they're not
United
just
States.
singing in their own register, they're actually singing an octave lower in some cases in the tenor register to make it almost indiscernible from an actual tenor chazan. And I'll bet you have some wonderful examples for us.
We do have, what's amazing is that we do have wonderful examples, both actually of some Yiddish theater singers who sing liturgical or quasi-liturgical songs. And we have recordings, of course, of the Chazantas, who were much, at a little bit later time period. So we're talking radio in the 30s and 1930s, 1940s, which of course is a modern period. So some of the examples that we have, women took on stage names, if you will. So we have Lady Cantor, Madame Sophie Kurtzer, and she was born in the 19th century, but performed in the early 20th century. Bernice Kanevsky Hausman, who called herself Bathsheba, and Jean Gornish, who was known as Shendela de Chazanta, Perla Feig, known as the Hungarian Chazanta, Goldie Malowski, and Fredi Oischer. Those were some.
And I recognize some of those names as coming from illustrious cantorial families.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Some of them sang with their dads or in groups. Some of them sang on their own. And many of them, were trained in cantorial families or by cantors.
Yeah, certainly the Oisher family and the Malowski family recognize
Right.
those.
Right. So Fredi Oischer is the sister of Moishe Oischer.
So set us up. Tell us about the examples we're going to be hearing.
Okay, so I have today an example of a Kadusha sung by Perla Fay. And she had a very lower voice. She wore a cantorial garb, that is, at the time, the taller hat, hat, Hazan hat, and she wore robes to look like a cantor. But of course, she wasn't an ordained cantor, and she sang only in performance venues. Well, then we have Jean Gornish. She was born in 1915, and she called herself Chandela de Jacinta. We're going to hear a Nenu by her. She was born in Philadelphia, and we know about her that she made up her mind very early on in her life to sing cantorial music. In 1936, she started using this title Jacinta, and she started singing in the late 1930s, around 1937 is the earliest that I know about, on radio in Philadelphia. She was an alto, and she was also in commercials and so on. She did the usual radio things where people did singing and they did some commercials. She did a real shift in the late 30s, starting to call herself the Chandela de Jacinta, the world's only woman's cantor. That was her advertising, but of course she wasn't. But but she became quite famous. She was called a sweet singer, which of course this kind of title is used frequently for cantors, sweet singer of Israel. And she went on and she did recital programs. She appeared with other cantors in many times types of cantorial programs and entertainment venues and so on. So she had a great fan club at the time. And eventually we see that she does those kinds of tours, seders, and going where people would go to large venues or holiday venues or hotels for a big seders and the like. And she did that. She also assisted cantors with high holidays and things like that at these kinds of venues, but she was not ordained or in a synagogue with her singing.
So, Judy, a couple of questions at this point. Well, first of all, to clarify for those who may not understand, the term chazan or chazan is a cantor, and chazanta would be a Yiddishized feminine version of chazan. But
That's right.
two things occur to me, and I wonder if you may want to comment on this. One is you say that these women, such as Shendele, had a fan club, and I wonder if this is a outgrowth of feminist movements from the time. And then the second, which kind of goes along with that, is
Interesting.
you said she appears on stage with chazonim, with cantors. I assume you mean the male cantors. Was there any
Yeah,
controversy of having a woman, a self-proclaimed chazanta, appearing together with them?
apparently not. And we're going to see that even some of the women who later became actual cantors started off singing with other male cantors in these kind of concert venues or commercial venues. Uh, there's kind of this uh, process that is a slow process where over time, over several decades, where you see women who are in entertainment venues singing with established cantors, some of them very famous, uh, and then eventually we see later, several decades later, that those same women become actual cantors in
Hmm.
synagogues. At this time, in the 30s and 40s, that was not the case.
Right, that'll be the next chapter. But so
Yes,
what are we going to hear by Shendele?
we're going to hear her Anenu. Well, as you know, Freda Oysher was the sister of Moshe Oysher, one of the most famous cantors of the golden age of Chazanut. And he also was a movie star. Fredi, who was born actually in Bessarabia, part of then the Russia Empire, and she was born in 1913 and lived to 2003. So she died at the age of 90. She also was a daughter of a cantor and sang with the father in the synagogue. They were tutored in the chants in the synagogue. But that did not mean she sang in the synagogue during services. She learned everything and she sang everything, but she didn't sing it for services. She's She began her career as really a child actress in Yiddish theaters, and in all the New York venues. I guess it was called the Second Avenue kinds of areas there. And she became famous for all her roles. And she became one of those women who began singing cantoral music on the stage. One of the interesting things about Frady is that she toured very widely throughout the United States and even abroad, performing cantoral music and theater songs, liturgical chants. It was all part of the same kinds of thing. Part of the show is all mixed in together. And so they were in the circuit, so to speak. Her daughter is Marilyn Michaels, and who is also a well-known artist. We're going to hear Frady singing Sim Shalom, which is a very interesting version of this, and I think you'll really like it.
Sim Shalom. Toy bayer hol vor kasam khoyis rawe
Also born in the 1920s, in 1925 was Bernice Konevsky, who married Hausman and became Bernice Konevsky Hausman. And she gave herself the stage name Bathsheba. And one of the things that's really interesting about her, she came from a wealthy Jewish family in Philadelphia and decided to go into show business. The stage name was so the name would not be associated with her family initially, until I guess she got established, what have you. And she did the whole Borscht Belt, Catskill Mountain performance thing. She starred in a program called Soul of a People. She was a really popular Catskill popular singer. She sang kind of in the style of Judy Garland, if you will. That was the time in the 1950s. And you'll hear in the sound recording I have, it's really definitely set in the 1950s because you have the orchestration is a very large orchestration that makes it builds up the nature of the entertainment. So it's a very interesting thing.
Should we call it schmaltzy?
uh, Today we might think of that. At the time, people loved it. They loved the idea of dressing up the music and making it bigger, more like a movie background music and stuff like that. So this is entertainment music. And what's really interesting also is she does a piece of music, Sheyibona Beis Hamikdash. And this is a 1954 recording on Capitol Records. And you'll hear this very large orchestration set to cantorial music and building up the sophistication level was so popular in the Jewish market at that time. An interesting thing that I found out from Henry Saposnik. He gave a talk on an African-American woman who was in the circuit in the 1920s doing the cantorial music. And she called herself the Black Chazanta. And her name was Goldie Steiner. I don't know whether she was Jewish or not. There are a lot of stories about her origins, where she came from. There were a lot of things that were made up kind of as advertising about her background, whether she came from Ethiopia, was an Ethiopian Jew. That was probably not true, but nevertheless, she was part of this sort of scene of Hazantes where she did cantoral music and sang for audiences at in performance venues in New York. Yeah, it's a very interesting and fascinating chapter about the interactions of Jews and African Americans in so much music, not just jazz and not just popular music and not just Broadway, kinds of things, but in all kinds of types of music, including cantoral music. A very interesting thing to learn about.
Fascinating. Well,
Yeah.
let's move on to the next chapter where we see women officiating as cantors in a synagogue in a liturgical basis, although not accepted officially by the establishment. So, what brought about this change? And tell us about that, please.
Well, the first evidence that I have learned about in the United States of a woman actually serving as a cantor in synagogue during services and acting in the role of a cantor is Julie Eichberg Roswald. And this is in the 1800s. So she was born in Stuttgart in 1847. Her father was a cantor. Moritz Eichberg was a famous cantor there. Her uncles were cantors, and her grandfather was cantor. So she comes from a long line and a large family of musicians and cantors. She came to the United States and became an opera singer and an opera star and traveled throughout the United States singing opera and was quite famous and quite wealthy from her singing. Uh, and she had a terrific career. Uh, but in 1884, she and her husband, primarily due to his health, decided to go to California and leave the operas. There were a lot of operas that were traveling operas companies that she was with. And when she came, within a few months of having arrived in San Francisco, the Temple Emmanuel there asked her to preside and to lead the services because the local cantor had passed away suddenly. And she did. And they decided to keep her on as the cantor for their synagogue for 9 years. So between 1884 and 1893, she was called cantor soprano and was doing all the things that cantors do, singing in the services as the solo, singing and leading the services. She chose the music. She directed the choir. So really in the sense that a modern cantor would come into a synagogue and lead the choir and direct it and bring in new music and train everyone and all those things. She had that role. So it was a very interesting thing. And what we see from Julie Roswald is that there's been a question, well, how did that happen in a Reform synagogue? Even back then, that there was a woman.
And, Judy, let me just interrupt to make sure everyone understands that since the beginning of the institution of the synagogue, as far as we know, the role of the cantor, the person who led the prayers, whether shaliach tzibur, chazan, whatever we want to call that person, was exclusively male. Women were not allowed to lead the prayers in the synagogue. And even at the beginning of the Reform movement, the radical reform, the less radical reform of the 19th century, you would never find women in this position, barely even allowed to sing in choirs. So this is a real radical innovation that you're speaking about.
That's right. And yet for her, in her terms of her career, it didn't seem quite as radical as that, I suppose, because she was so well versed, not only in Chazanut and Jewish music. She had sung with her husband in Baltimore with Rabbi Zold and Rabbi Zold's congregation. She was familiar with the families of many of the different communities throughout Baltimore. So one of the things we see in the United States is that the lines between Reform and other movements was not as strict or solid as or defined as it is today. Some Reform synagogues had gender separation. Some more Orthodox communities had people sitting in family pews. I mean, it was just simply not as defined in America as it is today. And if you study the synagogues and communities in Baltimore and other communities in the United States in the 19th century, you'll see that. And one of the things was women singing in choirs was an accepted role in many synagogues and in many Jewish communities, not just Reform, in the
In the
19th
19th
century.
century. Yeah.
Yes. Now, what happened was there were no women leading a service during a particular, holiday or Shabbat or anything like that. But in other venues, for example, dedication of synagogues, uh, community events, there were many women singing in choirs and in along with the men in mixed settings in the United States. This is something that's not, widely understood. And you also have to understand that there were large choral societies throughout the United States, and Jews were participating in those large choral societies and had Jewish large choral societies in the United States. So there were many women trained to sing synagogue music in the United States. Although they sang primarily as part of an SATB, it's part of a mixed choir. Now, there were also soloists. One of the things that's not widely understood is that there were sometimes Christian women who were brought in as a soloist in a synagogue setting in the United States.
Well, let me just interject here to remind our listeners that in the early 19th century, the very beginning of the Reform movement in Germany, one of the things that they did was to get rid of the role of the cantor, get rid of the role of the chazan. And basically, the rabbi led the services instead, and they would have a choir, they would have a cantorial soloist. So that's the position you're speaking about now, where apparently the women and even non-Jewish women would serve in that, perhaps because there were not others who were capable or trained.
Right, because if they didn't have any good singers or what have you, there were also organists. Many of the organists in Europe were women. Jewish women were organists in the 19th century and early 20th century. We have the names of lists and lists of them. So women did perform musical roles in synagogue in different ways than we normally think of today, or might think was the case in the 19th century. And the other thing you have to remember is that in the United States in the early days, it was difficult for Jewish communities to get trained leadership into their community, to get them to come from Europe. And, the United States was considered, not a wilderness, if you will, but in some cases not as developed communities as there were in Europe with those large synagogues and chorals and very large, sophisticated settings for people who had good training. So you see a lot of people taking on roles that would possibly not have been the case had there been, the way to train people and have more trained people coming in. However, you get people like Julie Rosewald, who had been trained in her father, sitting at her father's knee, so to speak, where he had a school and she could hear everything that was going on, and she learned classical Southern German Chazanut, and she was very well versed in Hebrew and so on. Both she and her husband knew Hebrew. Now, Jacob Rosewald, her husband, was trained, a native American from Baltimore. He was also trained in leading as a Shaliach Tzibur and reading Torah and so on. So you had these skilled people, but on the other hand, they're across the country in the other Temple Manual in New York City, you see that the rabbis there also hired a woman soloist, and that was Josephine Jacobi. She was a singer at the Metropolitan Opera, an American born and American trained, which at the time was unusual for women opera singers to be completely American trained, but she was. And she became hired as a soloist in their choir in New York. and did many of the parts of the solo. In fact, she was the soloist who sang at the funeral of Isaac Mayer Wise. You see here the beginnings of these kinds of roles for women being accepted as community leaders, as singing at important events under the auspices of synagogues.
Do we have recordings of any of the singers that you just mentioned?
I don't have a recording of her singing liturgical music, but I do have a recording of Josephine Jacobi singing from an opera aria. It's on a very early Edison disc, and we can hear that now. And she's singing here L'Air de Stefano from an opera.
Let's listen to a little bit of that.
Yeah.
All right, next chapter, Judy, is Jewish women cantors being formally accepted by the establishment. When and how does that come about?
But, I see this as a process that started as early as the 1950s. A woman by the name of Betty Robbins, who was actually born in Greece and came to the United States, becomes the first woman accepted into her synagogue in modern times as a female cantor. Now, she's not ordained by a formal school, but she was definitely considered the cantor of the synagogue that was at Temple Avodah in Oceanside, New York. And Betty Robbins really kind of led the way. And she, at the time, she thought she was the first woman cantor in Jewish history, but of course, she just, it was lost to history at that point in time that there had been these women singers before. And then we began to see that women are accepted into cantorial schools, which had been, many of them kind of established right after World War II, where the Jewish community starts taking on the, many more roles and responsibilities in world Jewry. The establishment of the cantorial schools after the destruction of European Jewry and institutions. And so these schools, as you know, followed movements and were associated with movements. But increasingly, they started allowing women to become educated as teachers and so on, but they were not granted ordination, but they were getting degrees. And then we see in the 1970s that Barbara Osfeld applies to Hebrew Union College in New York to become the first woman to be granted not only a degree, but get ordained. And she was accepted and she was ordained and she was given, sent out to a post and has had an illustrious career as a Reformed cantor. And from there, you begin to see that other women followed. So we see the second woman who was ever ordained in the Reform movement as a cantor was Sheila Klein, and she was local to Boston. And she went on from that career to become a pastoral counselor, to specialize in gerontology, and she served many institutions as a chaplain.
I'm sure this was controversial, the idea of these seminaries, the Reform and Conservative seminaries in New York, accepting women students and then accepting them for ordination.
That's correct. I mean, there was a lot of discussion, and it was a process. But again, when Barbara Osfeld became ordained, then immediately, of course, the question opened up whether the other liberal movements were going to also have women as cantors. And amazingly, they had women rabbis before they had women cantors. And I think that's an important point to note, that singing had its own special set of, and leading in prayer by singing had its own sort of set of restrictions that was stricter than teaching or being a rabbi. What we see happening, say, for the conservative movement is that there are some unofficial women performing in sort of unofficial roles, if you will. They are not ordained, but they become cantors in synagogues the way that Betty Robbins did. You see Linda Rich, who grew up in an Orthodox family and comes from a long line of cantors again. Her father was a cantor. She is a fifth generation cantor, and her daughter makes a sixth generation cantor. But at the time, when she was first becoming or serving as a cantor as early as 1978, which is not that much longer after the reform, but she was not ordained. It was not until much later that she was awarded a diploma as Chazan, and that was not until 1996. However, she served in congregations all that time. So she was serving as a cantor in a conservative synagogue, but not as an ordained cantor for a long time. And what we see as early as the late 1970s, there was Elaine Shapiro who became a cantor. She had a degree in sacred music from JTS, but she was not ordained. So again, these are kind of steps that happen where women are granted a type of status or type of degree, but they're not given ordination. And then also you have Doris Cohn. Now, Doris Cohn was really kind of a chazanta, if you will. She did the whole circuit of singing in popular venues. She worked with Shalom Secunda. She worked and sang with Moshe Ganshoff. She sang with Richard Tucker. And so she was in the Concord Resort, for example, and singing with Richard Tucker. And then she became a music director and so on like that. And then eventually a cantor. But it was a process where you see people like this are still around. The chazan type of person didn't just end suddenly. You see many women doing that role.
You went back to the term chazanta. Now, when women were ordained as cantors, they didn't call themselves chazanta.
That is correct.
But they used the standard male term as a unisex term, chazan. Do we find chazanit or anything like that, or either in the Hebrew or the English?
I'm not really finding that used widely. I'm really finding that in the liberal movements who were ordaining women, they use the term chazan or cantor.
Right, where women rabbis will often go by rabbanit instead of rav or marat, although there's some confusion because rabbanit could be the Hebrew form of rebbetzin, which is the wife of a rabbi. So I think the women cantors have been rather careful about keeping the term chazan to make sure that there is no confusion there.
You know, by the time women are being granted ordination, and in the 1970s for reform, and not until 1980s for the conservative movement, these women, the two women who were first ordained in the conservative movement, Erica Lippitz and Marla Rosenfeld Barugel, they were permitted to prepare for being a chazan. And it was, took quite a number of famous cantors supporting that to happen. And eventually that did happen, and they were ordained in 1987. So it's some years after Barbara Ostfeld, about 12 years later, that you see the the conservative movement. And it was very, very controversial in the conservative movement. But you did have the support of many uh, conservative cantors, men, established cantors, who championed the role of women to have that change happen in the conservative movement. And it was in 1990 that the Cantors Assembly formally admitted female cantors into their organization. So that's a new development in the history of Jewish music and culture. So you do have the first president of the Cantors Assembly, who was a woman, is Nancy Abramson, and she was serving from 2013 to 2015, just a few years ago.
And she's now dean of the cantorial school at the Jewish Theological Seminary.
Right. So you can see these massive changes have come about even in the last 20 years and 30 years. It's just been a large shift in the role of women and acceptance in formal institutions and liberal movements. The first woman in the Reconstructionist movement, or Reconstructing Judaism, I guess it's called today, was Sharon Hordes. She was trained at Gratz College and at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College. And she was not ordained as a cantor until 2002. So very, very recent in terms of that. And the Jewish Renewal Movement, they ordained their cantors through the Alliance for Jewish Renewal. So these kinds of formal ordination programs and recognition of Jewish women is a fairly recent phenomenon, I would say. Even though service of women goes back, a very long time, accepting women in the role as the formal leader of prayer, the Shliach Tzibor, is a new phenomenon.
Let's go on from there to what it sounds like. So it seems to me that Jewish women cantors today are making a unique contribution. They are not simply singing the traditional cantorial repertoire in a different octave. They are not simply singing Nusach, but I think they're creating a new repertoire and a new performance style that these women uniquely have innovated and cultivated.
I agree. I was going to show you some of the distinctions between someone trained and steeped in traditional Chazanut, like Deborah Ketchko-Gray, and we can listen to a short bit of her Shema Koleno, a very famous piece, and then move to some of the newer pieces of music by cantor Benji Ellen Schiller, who teaches at Hebrew Union College.
And we should add that both of those women are alumni of the Zamir Chorale of Boston.
Oh, Cantor Schiller is also a composer. And this is one of the things that's been so remarkable, is so many of the women becoming not only the singers of Israel, but the composers of new song for Jewish liturgical music. And the massive shift in music that has happened in the last 25 to 30 years, which is primarily American, more popular, and away from traditional Chazanut. The first piece we'll listen to is a traditional piece, the Shema Koleno by Deborah Ketchko, sung by Deborah Ketchko-Gray.
תיקח ממנו.
And then I'd like to listen to this piece by composed by Benji Ellen Schiller.
Be
I think that one of the things that we're seeing with women becoming the sort of singer-songwriters, if you will, is following on a trend that happened starting really in the 1960s and 70s of bringing folk music into the synagogue, American folk music. Uh, you had Debbie Friedman, of course, being the most famous case. She was not a cantor, but later in life, she did study more cantorial music with Jack Mendelson and others. What you see also is this trend towards more popular American-based genre type music and changing the atmosphere, the style, the way that the liturgy is understood in music, and women creating, I would say, music that is celebratory rather than supplicative as much. You know, instead of there's more joy, there's more feelings of celebration in a lot of this music. The other thing that's happening is a movement in some of the liberal movements of bringing in instruments into the synagogue again. We know that one of the most famous people that has been bringing instrumental or other types of music back into the synagogue in the renewal movement and in some of these liberal movements where instrumentation is changing to reflect bringing in cultural aspects from other traditions. One of those has been a rabbi. She's a cantor and a rabbi, Shefa Gold, and she has written many, many pieces of music. And the style of her music brings in traditions or chanting, if you will, not traditional Jewish chant, but chanting brought in from the style of it comes from other traditions. And these other traditions are blending and being blended with some traditional sounds and being blended with Jewish liturgical texts. So that's a very interesting change that you see. Others are bringing in aspects of American popular culture, such as American folk music, or more Broadway sounds, if you will, or more pop musical sounds to worship. And these trends have been coming along for quite a number of years, and there are a lot of women singer-songwriters who are doing that. One of the great singer-songwriters of the last more than 30 years has been Linda Hirshhorn, who sang with the Mir Chorale in New York. She became a leader of a vocal ensemble and has now, become a cantor and sings in congregations, but also continues to write new music.
Sukat shlomecha, sukat shlomecha. Ushmor tzeiteinu uvoenu lechaim uleshalom me'ata ve'ad olam ufros aleinu Sukat shlomecha, sukat shlomecha. Give us this night time to lie in peace. May we rise to new life each day. Let there be shelter for the brokenhearted, a shelter of peace for all.
So one thing, Josh, that's kind of interesting today, as you know, we started out with women not being allowed to lead prayer in synagogue. And today, possibly more women than men are being ordained as cantors in the United States in the liberal movements. And when I say liberal movements, of course, because women are not being ordained or leading services in Orthodox synagogues in terms of mixed services. But one of the things that I have come across, and I attended one of these, was some Orthodox synagogues have separate services where women are leading the prayer in their own room or section of a synagogue, and it's an all women's minyan, if you will. And it's uh, a very interesting development because women know this. If they know the music, they know how to lead services, they know the Hebrew, they are well educated, and they have the desire to do that. So today you have all sorts of things happening, and women doing paraliturgical music on recording in Orthodox settings
I'm going to
for
jump in
women
here.
only.
Yes, this is happening in many, shall we say, modern Orthodox synagogues, the separate women's service. And then parallel to that is another phenomenon of Orthodox women entertainers or performers who will perform with only women in the audience.
Right. That's right. I agree with that. That's exactly the phenomenon that we're seeing, not only in the United States but in Israel as well. And they are writing paraliturgical music, new music, and they are also leading their own worship services, and in some cases, and that's more modern Orthodox settings. I guess one of the takeaways I'd hope that people will remember is that women have all along been participating, but that it has changed over the years. But today we can say that women have altered the way that prayer is heard and received by their voices and by their creative energies that have gone into interpreting the liturgy. And I'm sure that that will continue in the future.
Judy, this has been great. What a wealth of information that you have brought to us. I have learned
Thank
so
you.
much today, and I'm sure our audience has also. Thank you so much for being with us.
You're very welcome anytime.